Good Thursday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for August the 10th. Today we are reading together in 2 Samuel chapter 5, which is going to give us details concerning David's ascension to the throne of Israel. And we'll also see where he is able to overtake and establish Jerusalem as his capital city. And yet, just because he's now king doesn't mean there are not going to be troubles. We're going to see the Philistines show back up again and cause a little issue for David here within this text. So let me get the text of 2 Samuel chapter 5 up on the screen, and we'll read along together here. 2 Samuel chapter 5, beginning in verse number 1. Second Samuel chapter 5, verse number 1. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Here we are, your own flesh and blood. Even while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led us out to battle and brought us back. Yahweh also said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. King David made a covenant with them at Hebron in Yahweh's presence, and they anointed David king over Israel. They anointed David king over Israel. Verse number 4, David was 30 years old when he began his reign. He reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the land. The Jebusites had said to David, "You will never get in here. Even the blind and the lame can repel you," thinking David can't get in here. Yet David did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. He said that day, "Whoever attacks the Jebusites must go through the water shaft to reach the lame and the blind who are despised by David. For this reason it is said, the blind and the lame will never enter the house." David took up residence in the stronghold, which he named the city of David. He built it up all the way around from the supporting terraces inward. David became more and more powerful, and Yahweh God of the armies was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David. He also sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that Yahweh had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he arrived from Hebron, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. There we go. In verse number 16. Verse number 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they all went in search of David. But he heard about it and went down to the stronghold. So the Philistines came and spread out in the Rephaim valley. Then David inquired of Yahweh, "Should I attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me?" Yahweh replied to David, "Attack, for I will certainly hand the Philistines over to you." So David went to Baal Perazim and defeated them there and said, "Like a bursting flood, Yahweh has burst out against my enemies before me." Therefore, that he named that place, the Lord bursts out. The Philistines abandoned their idol there, and David and his men carried them. The Philistines came up again and spread out in the Rephaim valley. So David inquired of Yahweh, and he answered, "Do not attack directly, but circle around behind them and come at them opposite the balsam trees. When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, act decisively, for then Yahweh will have gone out ahead of you to strike down the army of the Philistines." So David did exactly as Yahweh commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Geba to Gazer. And that is 2 Samuel chapter 5. So David now is going to ascend to the throne. Remember, he'd already been recognized as king in the southern part of Israel in Judah. He was king down there. Ishbosheth was the king over the northern portion. Ishbosheth's portion was probably double to 3 times the size of David's. But with his death and with the work of Abner and with everything that's taken place, now we see at the beginning of beginning of chapter 5 that all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, and they recognized that even while David was serving under Saul, that David was really the more powerful one. He was the more influential one. He was the man in Israel who really had the leadership pedigree, and they were excited for him to now take up this role as Yahweh's shepherd over Israel. So everybody came, they all made a covenant, and everything. See, everything is made good in the first 3 verses. We're told in verse number 4 that David is 40 years old when he begins his reign, and he was 30 years old when he began his reign, and reigned for 40 years. He was in Hebron for 7.5 of those years, and then he moved on to Jerusalem and made that his capital city. And it makes sense that he would make Jerusalem the capital city. It was very centrally located within the land of Canaan, and also had very good defense, natural defenses, which is what's discussed beginning in chapter 6, where David overtakes Jerusalem. Now, if you go back to the beginning, I believe it's the beginning of the Judges story, Jerusalem had actually already been captured by Israel once, but then it had been taken over again by the Jebusites. I believe at that point it was called Solemn. But as it is overtaken now by David, it's renamed Jerusalem. But the funny, I guess the interesting part about the story is that the Jebusites that, you can't overtake this place. We could set up the lame and the handicapped and the blind to defend it, and you won't be able to do anything about it. But one of the things to remember is that there's more detail given for us about this story later on. I think it's in the story of, I think it's in the writing of the Chronicles, in which there's more detail given about David's overtaking of Jerusalem there. And it gives more detail about them going up through the water shaft and such. And they do end up taking it, and they, start joking around about the lame and the blind and having them in this place. It's just very interesting to see the arrogance of the Jebusites, and then how David is able to overcome them without too much of an ordeal. At this point, David takes up residence in this stronghold of Jerusalem. He becomes more and more powerful, and he ends up having other kings from nations surrounding him. Hiram of Tyre ends up sending him a lot of supplies for him to be able to build a palace. And he just recognizes that Yahweh was with him, and that Yahweh had established him, and that Yahweh was blessing him. Now, verses 13 through 16 give us one of the unfortunate realities of David's reign, and the fact that he continued to do what we saw at the beginning of chapter 3, continue to amass concubines and wives and more children, again, acting like a king of the nations surrounding him. But that was not something that God wanted his kings to do. Deuteronomy 17 speaks specifically about God's desire for his kings not to amass wives, but that's something we see David doing here. Beginning of verse 17 and finishing out the chapter, we have the Philistines, who are, they're probably a little surprised, but then they probably look over at Achish and say, "See, Achish, we told you this guy can be trusted," because now they hear that David is the king over all of Israel, and they're ready to be a thorn in his side as well. They end up attacking, going into the Rephaim Valley. David does as he ought to do. He inquires of Yahweh, possibly through the priest or a prophet or the ephod, to see whether or not it is something that he needs to do. In attacking the Philistines, Yahweh says, yes, you need to. So he goes and he attacks, and he is able to defeat them in this place called Baal Perazim. And in doing so, there is a reversal of what we see in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 11, where the Philistines attack and defeat Israel, and they lose control of the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant is taken by the Philistines. Well, here now, the Philistines are defeated. Their idols are left behind, and David and his men carry them off. Well, there's a second time that the Philistines come to the valley of the Rephaim, and David once again inquires of Yahweh whether or not he needs to attack. Now, you might be thinking that David is thinking that Yahweh would tell him to do exactly what he did before, but things change up. It reminds me this does of the story of Moses and the water from the rock. The first time he's told to strike the rock, and water comes out. The second time he's told to talk to the rock, and water would come out. Well, the first time here, David is told to just attack like normal, but the second time he's told to sneak around from behind. And when you hear, verse 24, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, time to act decisively, go out and strike down the Philistines. What's going on here? Is this the Lord sending a supernatural wind to allow the trees to feel as if they're being marched upon with the wind rustling them? Or is this a sign of an angelic army or supernatural army coming down to attack the Philistines? Could be one, could be either, could be both going on here. But simply stated, Yahweh gave David instructions for how he was to proceed within this battle. And David listens, and David again achieves a great victory, striking down the Philistines all the way from Geba to Gazer. Now, it's interesting. I want to note here that verse 25 says that David did exactly as Yahweh commanded him. This is going to contrast with the next chapter, in which we don't see David doing that, and it leads to some disastrous consequences. Hope that you'll join us tomorrow as we read together in 2 Samuel chapter 6. If you have any questions or comments, observations about 2 Samuel chapter 5, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday, and we'll be back at it tomorrow again, reading together from 2 Samuel chapter 6. Take care, and God bless.